Hi, everybody, and welcome to our live panel event. My name is Molly Whittington. I am the Director of Outreach for Out for Business. Out for Business is a really cool club on campus and organization on campus where we promote a safe space and places where people can come and feel like themselves in the business school. We also advocate for a lot of rights and changes in the business school within our community. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Brian. He's our director. And I hope that you guys enjoy our panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly. Hi, everybody. My name is Brian Pham. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm currently the executive director at Out for Business here. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Molly. To kick us off, I know everybody's watching on our YouTube live stream right now. If you can use a chat, let us know where you're calling from. And then also, quick question, what are you looking forward to as the weather warms up? I know right now if you're in Utah, I'm looking out the window and I see a blizzard. So I'm really excited for summer, but let us know. Our goal today is to explore advocacy and discuss how allies can be effective advocates for the queer community. Today we'll be defining what good advocacy looks like, what's a good advocate and what's a bad advocate, what an individual can do to support queer individuals in the workplace. And today we hope to give everybody in the audience an effective set of tools and tips that they can employ today as an advocate. After today's panel, we'll be emailing everybody an advocate toolkit where we'll recap some of the important things we covered today, as well as additional resources to explore. So without further ado, we're going to introduce our wonderful panelists today. First, we have Ariel Malin, who is the program coordinator at the University of Utah Health Transgender Health Program, and then Chloe Agen, who is the home director at Encircle Salt Lake City. Thank you so much for joining me. To do some introductions, would you guys mind introducing yourselves with your pronouns, a little bit about what you do in your current roles, and then also, what are you looking forward to as the weather warms up and we're not in a blizzard?
Chloe, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. My name is Chloe Agen. I use they, them pronouns. As Brian mentioned, I'm the home director at Encircle Salt Lake City. At Encircle, we provide life-affirming therapy, programming, and services to LGBTQ youth, families, and communities. And what I do, I run all of Encircle Salt Lake City. And what I'm looking forward to the most in this, when the sun comes out, is just to be able to be outside and like be in the sun. Nothing specific.
Hi, my name is Ariel Malin. I use she, her pronouns, and like Brian mentioned, I'm the program coordinator for the Transgender Health Program here at the university. My role mostly includes things like marketing and outreach, managing our patient and family advisory board. We do a lot of community engagement, and then I work very closely with our two patient coordinators. And the Transgender Health Program is a multidisciplinary healthcare program that offers services, gender affirmation services to our transgender and gender diverse community members. And something I'm looking forward to is those wonderful farmers markets that happen in Salt Lake City. So super excited for that.
Get that produce, okay. We are so honored to have you both here today to join us. We couldn't have thought of anybody else better to speak about advocacy. And with that, we can just jump right into our panel today. So I'd love if you could both answer, what is advocacy? What does it look like? Who can be an advocate? Ariel, would you mind going first?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So I think when this question came up, it was a conversation around, what's the difference between allyship and advocacy? And I thought that was a really important distinction to maybe describe for folks. So in a little bit of the literature research that I did kind of prior to this session, looking at allyship and advocacy, they're both verbs that are intended to describe the work of inclusion and equity, but to be an ally is to support. And this typically refers to someone who's outside of the marginalized group. And allyship is about bridging that gap between those with privilege and those without it. A person doesn't need to know everything about the group that they're supporting in order to be an ally. They just need to commit to standing up for others, even if it costs them a few moments of social discomfort. And that's actually a quote from Teaching Social Justice. So when we look at advocacy, advocacy is more focused on the phrase, nothing about us without us. And it can include people outside of the marginalized group. However, the shift in advocacy is ensuring that the disenfranchised groups that we're supporting are front and center in leading that conversation. So amplifying those voices with our privilege, whether that privilege be our race, our gender identity, sexual orientation, social class, ability, any other identity. And everyone can be an ally or an advocate, but it's important to maybe recognize the difference between the work of both of those titles.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ariel. I just really want to point out what you said about advocacy, that like nothing about us without us. I think it's really important when we do advocacy work that it really is those who identify with whatever kind of advocacy work, like they're at the forefront of the movement. And then like Ariel was saying, allyship is a lot of times for people who are outsiders. They're just learning, they want to be involved, but they don't really know where to start. So this is like educating yourself. Posting on social media could be a way to be an ally. Having conversations with your family members and your friends is a good way to be an ally. And then advocating is like a step up from that, right? It's really about making changes on like policy levels. It's really amplifying the voices of the community that you're advocating for. And in like the widest like definition of an advocate, it really is amplifying, donating, lobbying, driving the message to like broader world. And as Ariel mentioned, it is anyone from the inside or outside as well can do advocacy work.
I love that. I really do. And I think you highlighted something really critical there, is that in the audience that's viewing right now, they might be wonderful allies, but it's only through using their positions of privilege to amplify disenfranchised voices outside of this live stream is where they become an advocate. And I love that. I'd love to move to our next question. So why is advocacy in the workplace specifically still important? I mean, queer people are accepted in the United States at higher rates than ever before. You know, we have marriage equality, yada, yada, yada. Why is this still important? Like, who cares?
Chloe, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. Yeah, I would say that the biggest reason that it matters is because LGBTQ or queer people in the workplace, there's a lot of discrimination that happens, really. And for a lot of LGBTQ people, they don't know if it's safe to talk about their sexual orientation or their gender identity, and they're afraid that they'll be fired, or they're afraid that people will treat them differently. While it's more accepted, it doesn't always mean that people like have complete understanding of what it means to be a queer identified person. And that could come with like questions that are really uncomfortable. It could come with misunderstandings. So I think that's a really important reason why we still need to do advocacy in the workplace. And lots of organizations or companies don't have policies in place right now that helps against discrimination towards LGBTQ individuals.
Yeah, I think what Chloe mentioned was actually probably the biggest highlight for this question, is that not all workplaces have policies that protect us right now. So prior to the recent Supreme Court ruling in 2020, the Bostock v. Clayton, which some of you may have heard, is a pretty monumental piece of legislation that's gone through recently. So this is, prior to this, states could choose whether or not to explicitly offer protections to employees based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. And discrimination on the basis of sex has been interpreted pretty widely and differently, and historically has not really included LGBTQ plus people. However, this new ruling changes this, and it's pretty significant in that the justification now used to include LGBTQ plus people can now be used in different areas of our lives, including things like healthcare, housing, access to facilities, and even education. But the Equality Act, which is kind of being proposed right now, if this is passed, this will offer anti-discrimination protections across key areas of life for queer and trans people. And it allows us to, well, without the risk of future presidencies trying to interpret that law any differently. So legal protections provide some peace of mind for queer and trans people, but I think Chloe spoke to this pretty eloquently in that the culture of a lot of organizations are still struggling to be inclusive, and the things that we're experiencing in the workplace, like microaggressions and microassaults, continue to perpetuate erasure of LGBTQ plus expressions and identities. And they make us feel like we have to hide who we are at work still, regardless of these protections. So it's really critical to have advocates who continue to do the work to not only educate, but hold other colleagues accountable and amplify those voices that are being impacted the most.
Thank you so much for highlighting those issues. From both of your answers, it becomes very clear that we're just barely starting. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done. Let's start talking about that work, yeah? Let's talk about what advocacy in the workplace looks like. So somebody in the audience might be asking, what can I do as an advocate to stand up and support LGBTQ plus colleagues? What are some tangible and specific things in terms of things like training and resources and techniques can I utilize today?
I'll go ahead and start on this one if that's okay. I think this is it's an awesome question, but it's a big question. So there's a lot of different ways that we can be advocates. And I think, let's talk about those different ways. And I think the resources that are going to be sent afterwards are going to be really helpful too, for kind of that further reference and education. But like Brian mentioned, compared to previous generations, we have a lot more straight allies who are more likely to join ally programs, find value in LGBT people being out, and more likely to actually know an LGBT colleague compared to previous generations. So this is, I think, is really important to celebrate and actually encourage, so we can recruit those folks to help us break down the barriers in the cultures of our organizations. So due to living with ADHD, I wrote down a numbered list for y'all to kind of organize my thoughts around kind of what I've seen in best practice for advocacy, as well as what I've heard from other folks doing this work. So number one, normalize pronouns and gender neutral language. And if there's questions, we can kind of go into a little bit more depth, but I'm just going to kind of list some of these. Ask how we identify and what language we use around our identities, and don't assume. Recognize the impact of cis and heteronormativity. These are the assumptions that everyone is either cisgender or identifies with the sex they were assigned at birth, or heterosexual or straight. Know a little bit about our history and our experiences. Be open to having conversations about our identities, but remember to not out us. So LGBTQ plus people may be out with certain people or in certain environments, but not all. Then believe us when we share things about our identity or our lives, and don't correct us about the terms that we're using to define ourselves, because it may conflict with your understanding of those terms. Respect our boundaries. Not all questions are appropriate or should be expected to be answered. There's so many resources out on the internet these days, from Google to YouTube, of people just sharing their stories, and tons of other sources. So, maybe going there first might be a good step. Find ways to amplify our voices and don't speak for us. Advocate with HR and leadership for inclusive policies. So transitioning in the workplace policies, this could be dress code policies, equal access to facilities, chosen name and pronoun policies. A lot of these things don't exist in the current workplace. So being able to advocate for those and knowing that those directly impact our lives. Recommend required annual trainings for your staff or colleagues on intersectional allyship. This will raise awareness of issues of all marginalized communities face and what accountability work looks like in your organization. So what's the reporting structure if you are witnessing someone experiencing microaggressions or you yourself experience a microaggression, and knowing kind of how to raise the issue to your management. And then identify ways to recognize queer and trans employees by allowing them to self-identify in surveys, highlighting their stories, and then providing space for things like affinity groups or employee resource groups. And then I know this is a long list, so I've got 3 more for you, and then I'll be done. Advocate for resources and funding for LGBT initiatives. So that's really important. You know, a lot of corporations have come out and said, you know, Pride is not just one time a year, it's 365 days a year. So find ways to fund and resource LGBT focused initiatives. Recognize that our experiences about our gender and sexuality are unique to us. So, you know, the story that a trans or queer person might tell you is very unique to them and may not apply to the broader community. So just recognize that. And then lastly, advocate for affirming signage and allow employees to wear pride, pronoun pins, and have flags in their office. Having affirming signage is really key to being able to see ourselves in the workplace, and really contributes to our sense of psychological safety in the workplace. So that was a long list. I hope it made sense. I'm going to let Chloe go now.
Yeah, thank you, Ariel. I think that was a very comprehensive list. I just really want to highlight a couple of things that you said and then add on to my own. Just the normalization of pronouns and gender neutral language is really, really important. I know a lot of times people think that I'm only going to use my pronouns if I'm interacting with someone who I'm believed to be transgender or genderqueer, but really normalizing it in every conversation and every introduction in your email signature makes it comfortable for transgender and genderqueer individuals not to be singled out. That a lot of times we're really like thinking about the way we look, the way we appear, and when people are just using pronouns towards individuals like us, it makes us really think about like, how am I passing? Like, do people know? So I think that's really, really important. Another one I wanted to highlight was don't correct people with like their languages and their terms. All of our experiences are so different. And what I feel comfortable using could be completely different than what someone else would be really comfortable using. And it's really a process and it's my identity. I think that's really, really important. The advice that I brought to this was more of like policies, like how can we get policies changed in the workplace and like actionable steps. And I took this from the Human Rights Campaign. They're really fabulous. The first step is to identify allies. And this is allies like who in management is supportive of LGBTQ people, who in management understands what's going on, who's in charge of your equal employment opportunity compliance, who will need to sign off on a new policy. Does anyone in your business have experience with LGBTQ individuals, right? You really want to find people in management who can be an ally. And then you want to build support. So you want to talk to supervisors about what you're trying to accomplish. You want to make sure that they understand what you're doing and why it's important to you. So this would be starting like a dialogue with human resources, or even starting an LGBTQ employee resource group. HRC has a really great way. They line it out of how you can get those started. And then the last one is, once you have these things, how do you deliver your proposal? Set up a meeting with your human resource department or anyone else who's in the position of changing policies, and know your company, establish your credibility, gain those allies, right? The more people you have on your side, the more likely your company is to implement these policies.
Thank you both for that incredibly comprehensive and actionable list. I think oftentimes in these sort of discussions, vague terms are like advocate for your peers at the workplace, but both of you provided incredibly actionable items. I think our audience will really appreciate that. I'd love to further explore this idea that you both touched on earlier. Why is visibility so important in the workplace? A lot of individuals in a workplace might say discussing sexual orientation or gender identity is considered unprofessional. What would you respond to that?
I'll go first. I think it normalizes, like, we all have sexual orientation, we all have gender identities. And when we have these discussions, we're really normalizing this idea that everyone has these things. It's not just people who identify as LGBTQ who have sexual orientation, gender identities. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest point is the normalization of our identities is key to our safety. It's a key to inclusion. You know, the history of gender and sexuality has shown us that the reason people are kind of scared to have these conversations is because historically, we have been erased and we have been made to hide in society. And so when people don't see us, they don't know someone like us. They don't know a queer person or a trans person. And so I think there's fear around that when you're not familiar with, different types of gender expressions, gender identities, and sexual orientation. So I think it's just about becoming familiar with the fact that humans as a species are very diverse and our identities are such a spectrum of experience and don't really fall neatly into binary boxes of male, female, and straight, frankly. So
That's absolutely wonderful. And I think, at least for me personally, I've seen the power of having also visibility as a queer person in the workplace. It's seeing someone who is a director or manager be openly queer, and it's affirming. There's a sense of a emotional like burden being lifted off when you see that. Do either of you have any experiences or kind of explain what it means to you when you see another queer person in the workplace and why that visibility is important?
yeah, I'll take that one. So I think ultimately when I have seen someone that has either, and again, we can't tell whether or not someone is LGBT just by looking at them. But if they have felt safe to disclose that to me, or they're an openly out LGBT person in the workplace, that is so incredibly important because it allows me to say, as a queer bisexual woman, seeing someone in leadership like me is saying that that's a direction or that's a path that I can have. Like my career can look like that. I don't have to settle for less just because of my identity. So having that, I think it really speaks to queer and trans futures, being able to see visible out leadership. So yeah, maybe I'll stop at that.
Yeah, I think for me personally, it is really important. I come from like lots of minority identities. So growing up, like seeing a Black, queer, identified person in a position of power was really unheard of. And for me, if I was able to see that, I think that I would, as a kid, like felt more comfortable like embracing my identities, and like I would have been able to like know that if I identify as these things, it would be okay for me to like run a business or be the home director at InCircle. And I think for me now, I feel like I have that responsibility of being someone that other Black, queer youth and young adults that they can look up to, like Chloe has made it. They're, doing really great things with their life, and that they can accomplish those things too.
I think one thing I wanted to add, and this came up for me personally during Transgender Day of Visibility recently, is to recognize that visibility is awesome. It's amazing. However, it's also a privilege to be out and to be visible, and not everybody has that same opportunity. So just recognizing that with visibility as advocates, it's really important to advocate for protections for our communities, because without those, a lot of people will not feel safe being visible. So kind of just a note to kind of pair those two things together.
I think that's really, really great. I'm glad you touched on that point. Before we move on to our next topic, I just both wanted to acknowledge, I think both of you exemplified that sentiment, that idea of being that person that you needed 10 years ago. I think you both really exemplified that. So moving to our next topic, we asked our audience to send us some questions before the panel, and we wanted to highlight a few of them and dive into some hypothetical situations. So now that we've kind of got some tips under our tool belt, we've discussed actionable items. How do we apply them in situations like these? Chloe, this first hypothetical is for you. Hypothetical 1, my coworker recently came out as gay in the workplace, and how do I show support for them and engage in discussion without overwhelming them while still showing my support?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question and a very common experience that a lot of us have. I think the first thing is to remember that a decision to come out is to a group or a person is really one of safety, trust, comfort, and readiness. That this coworker that came out might not be out in other groups or in other parts of their life. And coming out is really a continued experience. It's not just like we come out one time in our life and we're out. It's literally every interaction I have to choose whether to come out or not to come out. So I think taking that and like understanding that that's a huge trust that this person has put into you for coming out. And then I think another thing is to understand that the questions that we can ask can be hurtful. I know a lot of times when someone comes out, we want to, be super supportive and ask all the questions and kind of shower them with love. But sometimes those questions and that love can be, like you said, Brian, like overwhelming, and having conversations with this person and knowing boundaries. Like what would I ask a cisgender heterosexual coworker in the workplace? Like, is that a similar question that I would ask this out person in the workplace, right? Just because someone discloses their sexual orientation doesn't mean that everything is fair game in the workplace. And then kind of touching back onto what we've talked about previously in the last question is to honor their experience. If they want to disclose things, great. If they don't, great. Don't question like the terms that they use. If they, share specific terms, let them, sometimes it's difficult for us to navigate our experience, and we don't need people to question that, especially in the workplace. And then my last advice would be to just be there, be supportive, allow them to come to you if there's like something that's going on, allow them to like, I don't know how to put this, just to know that you're safe, right? That you will advocate for them or show them support if something's going on, that you understand that. Yeah.
I think that's really wonderful. And I appreciated how you noted the often lesser known emotional burden that queer people carry of having to come out repeatedly, constantly. I think that not all non-LGBTQ plus people understand that fully and how emotionally taxing it can be. Ariel, I'd love to move on to our second situation. This person wrote in and said, I know that one of my team members is currently transitioning. This person hasn't told me or anyone on my team specifically, but I have heard from others within the workplace. How do I support this person while also giving them the space to communicate on their own terms?
Yeah, so, I think it's important to note before answering this question, as a cisgender individual, and just because I work with the Transgender Health Program, it's really important to me that I bring perspectives of trans folks into these questions. So I actually, prior to answering this, I asked my partner who identifies as non-binary and transgender, and I said, what is your experience around this? Like, what would you, want someone to do in this situation? And so kind of gleaning from that perspective and the perspective of other trans folks that have talked to me about kind of this topic, I kind of came up with, gender affirmation or transition is a really personal journey. Like we've talked about a lot, all of our experiences are so unique. So we can't assume what someone may want in the form of support just because of that. However, I think a safe standard to assume is treat them normally. If they're using a new name or pronouns that have been made public, make sure to be using them, and then correcting folks, your colleagues, management, even if they're making mistakes, just to remind them, friendly reminder, hey, that person goes by they, them, and they use this as their chosen name. Another note is someone may just be exploring their gender expression, and having folks confront them, even if it is to support them, may be assuming something about their identity, and goes back to that concept of potentially outing someone and creating an unsafe space. So transgender and gender diverse people don't want to be treated differently than other coworkers. An example that my partner gave me was, sometimes they get excessive compliments about their outfits when they're expressing more androgynous or more feminine expressing. And although that's positive, if they aren't doing it, like if the coworkers aren't doing that for other people, it will make that person stand out. And that's not really, what folks want. So another thing is, if you have a relationship with this colleague, it may be appropriate to ask them what they need from you regarding support. However, if there is no relationship and they're just a coworker that you see every once in a while, just hold others around you accountable and speak about them as they want to be referred to. So, and then rather than advocating for that one person that is transitioning in the workplace, advocate for a culture. Advocate for a culture of inclusion that promotes the visibility of LGBTQ people, and then pair those with the policies that we've been talking about to protect us in the workplace.
That's wonderful. Could I follow up with 2 questions? First, could you explain the concept of dead naming? What exactly is a dead name? And then also, what should an individual do if they use incorrect pronouns in the workplace or a dead name? What should they do?
Yeah, so dead naming refers to using a trans or non-binary person's birth name or former name. And misgendering is another term that you might hear, which is referring to someone's pronouns that are associated with an identity that they do not identify with. So, for example, I identify as a woman, I use she, her pronouns. And if you were to use he, him, that would be an example of misgendering, or assuming the pronouns that I use based on how I look or how I sound. And maybe Chloe, do you want to answer the question around, I'm sorry, what was the second question, Brian?
What should an individual do if they misgender somebody or use a dead name?
Yeah.
What steps should they take?
Yeah, I think if it's like in a conversation with another individual, I would just advise of just correcting yourself immediately. I have a lot of times, so I only use the they, them pronouns at work. It's a whole story behind why that is, but exclusively at work, I use they, them, and I have lots of times where my coworkers will accidentally use she, her pronouns, and if they simply are just like, sorry, they, them, or just correct themselves immediately, they, them, it's really fine. You don't want to make it like this whole thing of if you use someone's dead name or pronouns to profusely apologize and make it this whole thing, because we know that it can be difficult to get pronouns right, get names right. If you've known someone exclusively as one name and now you're trying to switch it to another name, we understand that. So if you just, make that switch, normally it's like a great experience for everybody.
I think you brought on a really good point there. It's like, it doesn't have to be a huge deal. And oftentimes, not everybody wants them to be singled out or brought a lot of attention to them. And so quickly acknowledging it sincerely and moving forward is really great. And I also think you highlighted something really notable there. Is that even in a workplace like in Circle, people still mess up. I think that's really important. Giving everybody amnesty to mess up, that's totally okay. What we're here is to have, a growth mindset and move forward and improve, right? We can't get it perfect every time. None of us can. And I think that's really, really important.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
Ariel mentioned this, but I really think it's important that even when we're having conversations when the person isn't there when we're using pronouns, it's really important to correct people if they are using wrong pronouns. I think that's like one of the biggest ways to show support when someone's not around.
I agree completely. I have a follow-up to both of these situations we just discussed. How would you advocate for either of these people that we discussed in the previous situation if your fellow colleagues at work or your environment at work was not welcoming at all? What would you do?
I think it goes back to a lot of what we were saying is that, advocating for your workplace culture, I think is going to be a little bit more helpful and less of a risk to potentially out someone and make it more of an uncomfortable situation for that person in the workplace. So going directly to your management and kind of letting them know like, hey, either I've experienced this or I've witnessed things that have indicated that our culture may not be as inclusive as we think it is. Because I think we always think that, oh, we're inclusive. Like, we have a non-discrimination policy, XYZ. But I think it's been shown that even management doesn't necessarily know their own policies sometimes. So as an advocate and as a queer and trans person, I think, it's important to know what our rights are in the workplace and being able to advocate for that. But then again, like including your management and your leadership in that conversation of saying, we might need some training. And then having leadership and training be, or leadership and management be on board with that training so that when we have that training, they're speaking before the training and saying, this is why this is important. This is why we want to do this, so that there is this sense of we're not just checking a box here, but this is something we really want to do to impact the culture around us.
Yeah, I think those are really great points, Ariel. Can you remind me the question, Brian? Sorry.
No worries. What can an individual do to advocate within an environment that is necessarily not really affirming, not welcoming, or you have colleagues that aren't affirming at all?
Yeah, just to echo what Ariel said, I really think like talking to management and knowing the policies, and if there aren't policies, helping get those policies passed in your organization or business. And I think like this is really important for advocates that aren't always identified as being LGBTQ. I feel like a lot of times like being an LGBTQ person, it can be really exhausting, like having to advocate for, non-discrimination at work or in your other spaces that you live. So realizing that LGBTQ people do have these burdens and trying to amplify and support and, take some of that burden off as a non-identified LGBTQ person advocate.
I think that's great. I think you really highlight how advocating for yourself can sound like a part-time job sometimes. With that, we're going to turn to some audience questions. I know we have some wonderful, wonderful audience questions, and I'd love to introduce two members of our leadership team here at Out for Business, Nolan Fan, who is our Director of Finance, along with Christy Ho, our Co-Director of Events, who will be asking some audience questions. Nolan, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. Hi, everyone. My name is Nolan Fawn. As Brian just mentioned, I'm the Director of Finance here at Out for Business, and I go with my he, him pronouns. And so the first question that we have is, with the majority of workplaces being virtual now, especially during the pandemic, interactions look a lot different than they used to. Do you have any advice or any tips for how advocacy could work in this new virtual environment that we're facing?
Can't remember who went first last time. So yes, virtual. Okay, so yeah, that's our whole world right now. So I think being able to integrate pronouns like we've been talking about when you're introducing speakers or you're just introducing yourself, that creates a culture of inclusion right from the get-go. It allows other people to self-identify if they choose, but also just kind of creates that space. And then if you're planning virtual events, which a lot of us are, so panel events, events for our community, some things that I've seen that have been just really impactful to create more of an inclusive space has been reading a land acknowledgement, which is, it's an acknowledgement that and I'm not going to speak very well to this, but it's pretty much acknowledging that the land that we are on is owned by Indigenous people, and to recognize those communities and honor them. And then other things would be add subtitles to any of your events to make sure that you're accommodating other folks. Make sure that you have an opportunity for people to let you know if they need an ASL interpreter. So there's all sorts of things to kind of create more of an inclusive virtual environment. And then as a leader or a facilitator in your meetings, pay attention to whose voices are being heard the most. And are they LGBT people? Are they, folks that get heard a lot? And if not, then invite us to share our feedback and expertise on topics. And it's okay to kind of talk to us after the meeting too and say, hey, did you have any additional thoughts about this? Because maybe it wasn't a safe space for us to bring up that feedback or topic. But knowing that you're reaching out and you care about the perspective that we have also makes us feel like we're included in day-to-day conversations with our work.
Yeah, and I think another thing is, like Ariel was saying, instead of calling people out, Zoom anxiety is like a really big thing for a lot of people. Like the muting can be very stressful. So like if you want to have other voices like be heard in these meetings, like if you just send someone like, hey, we would like to have you talk, or we're planning on having a segment, and we would like for you to share your voice if you can, because we haven't heard from you in a long time, or we'd like to amplify LGBTQ voices in our company. I think that's a really great thing to do as well.
All right. Brian introduced me earlier, but my name is Christy. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm the co-director of events for Out for Business. Got the next question, and this is directed towards Chloe. So what are tips to slowly start integrating more visibility into the workplace without alienating those who may be less familiar with the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah, I think the first place to start is trainings. I think trainings are a really great place to get everyone on board with similar terminology, with experiences of LGBTQ people. I know that InCircle does lots of trainings, the Utah Pride Center does trainings. I know that there are lots of other organizations who do trainings. So I think that's like a really, really great place, especially being like a cisgender heterosexual person, to realize like, maybe like I myself don't know, and I can like seek out those trainings myself. Or if I notice that my company at large, doesn't have these policies, or don't know as well, that bring that up to management and letting them know like, hey, I think this is a training that could be really great for us. And that would be open up more discussion.
Great. So our next question is that, are there nonverbal ways such as signs or posters that someone can use in the workplace to communicate LGBTQ plus safety and acceptance?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, y'all can already see in most of our screens, the rainbow is our sign. So the most up-to-date flag that our community is using is called the Progress flag. And mine isn't back there, but it's the rainbow flag, and it has this V-shaped shape on it, and it has like brown, black, and then it has the trans flag colors incorporated into it. And I think it's important to use that flag over just our normal rainbow flag, because the intention behind that is centering the voices of brown and black trans people as part of the movement towards LGBT equity and equality. Other things can be pronoun pins. So I'm looking around to see if I have one, and I don't. stickers that are just have affirming language on it. I'm trying to think of other examples I've seen. Most of my experience has been with clinic spaces. So although they're pretty picky about what we can have in the clinic spaces, they're usually pretty flexible around, like, you know, if it's a pin on your shirt or something, like you can do that. And then sometimes having, you know, depending on what your workplace is, having brochures or marketing materials that have LGBT people on them, depicting LGBT identities and expressions, is really, really helpful, because that is another sign of affirmation for us to see, besides just, you know, a welcome sign or something that, you know, has a rainbow on it, seeing our faces integrated into the products and services that workplaces are offering.
Yeah, I think Ariel answered that fabulously. I have nothing to add to that.
All right, so this one's going to be our last question, and it's directed towards Ariel. So as advocates / members of the queer community at the university, what do you think our role is when it comes to advocating for other oppressed groups, and how does intersectionality with queer identity come into play in this context?
Yeah, so as part of the work that I get to do with the Transgender Health Program, I come across this a lot, because our university is a very big place. So there's a lot of good work that's actually being done, but we have not quite figured out how to centralize all of those efforts. So I think as an advocate within the university system, try to learn about current initiatives that are happening on campus or at the hospitals and clinics, if that's where you work. And then identify who those leaders are in those spaces. Because when we know what our leadership is talking about, we can align our efforts with those efforts more strategically. And I think when we have the business case for our initiatives and policy recommendations, they're more likely to be heard when they're aligned with current efforts that are already happening at the university. I think bringing up intersectionality with this, you know, our university has started to create a big push around equity and inclusion, specifically around anti-racism, and LGBT equity does intersect with anti-racism. We have Black and Brown, trans, and queer people in our communities. So I think anytime that we are advocating for an LGBT specific initiative, aligning it with the anti-racism efforts that are going on campus, I think will, again, make it more likely that the initiative will be supported by leadership. And again, you're taking into account the fact that our community is intersectional and has a lot more identities than we sometimes talk about or create visibility for.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christy and Nolan, for coming in and giving us some audience questions. I think with that, we can ask our last question of the night, or is it noon? My goodness. Oftentimes, advocacy can feel like you're not making an impact. How do you combat the feeling that you're not doing enough, that the change you're trying to make isn't meaningful? How do you combat that feeling?
Yeah, I think that one thing to remember is that advocacy is multidimensional, and advocacy work can start with ourselves and not putting a lot of burden on what we're doing. It happens, like I said, within ourselves, amongst people, at a systematic level, institutional level. So there are a lot of ways to use your effort and use your energy. We're not going to be able to 100% of the time like make changes at a systematic level. We're not going to be able to 100% of the time, you know, make changes within our families or within our friend group. I think it's really just remembering that advocacy work comes in different forms, different shapes, different sizes, and really what is my capacity right now to do advocacy work, and acknowledging that, and then doing what I can do with my like emotional capacity right now. And if that changes in the future, if my position changes in the future as well, how can I use that and gear my advocacy work towards this new position that I have or new energy level that I have.
Yeah, I think what Chloe said is really important around I think being an advocate it's hard. It's a lot of hard work. And when you identify within the group that you are advocating for, it can be even more exhausting. So remembering that self-care is really important. And if you burn yourself out, we lose someone on our team to be advocating for us. And so finding a balance in your life and your advocacy work so you can be sustainable in the long term. Recognizing that advocacy is a lifelong journey. Find yourself a backup. If you're doing advocacy work at work or as a volunteer capacity, find a backup for your project so that you can take time and delegate so that your work doesn't have to stop necessarily. And then also remembering that, Chloe mentioned this, a lot of the things that we're advocating for are for system level and culture change, which can ultimately take years, decades, and sometimes centuries. So knowing that it's a long-term goal, I think at least helps me in my personal mindset realize that, if I go full throttle, I'm not going to be able to do this forever. So I need to be able to balance my personal life and my enjoyment with interacting with my community, and then have my advocacy work as well. So just creating that balance.
Thank you both so much for joining us today. And thank you to the audience for taking the time out of your day to join us as well. Today, we covered a lot of amazing topics within advocacy, and we hope that you can take what we've discussed today and make some meaningful impact in your workplaces and communities. We'll be following up with a toolkit as well as a guide covering a lot of the topics we discussed today, as well as additional resources to explore. If you're looking for ways to get involved with Out for Business and more events like this, and you're an alumni, keep an eye out for future events like these in your email, as well as following our Instagram page. And if you're a current student, be sure to get involved in our future events in our club. You can join us on Campus Connect. We offer amazing things such as mentorship events, volunteer opportunities, and a bunch of fun events like cooking nights and scavenger hunts. You can join our club by going on our Campus Connect page, and also to follow us on Instagram. I'm sure somebody will be tagging that in the YouTube live stream. And with that, we will close out. Thank you both so much for being here, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.